Hi, I'm Nicholas. For those of you who don't have me in your lab, I'm the lab leader for the Red Lab. And today I'm going to be working through a lecture on nationalism. I'm calling it Nationalism, Virtue, and Violence because as we parse through this lecture, we're going to be trying to uncover some of the ways in which nationalism is a much more nuanced conversation, especially in the status quo, than some of us may have been led to believe. So we're going to start very simply by defining nationalism, getting a working understanding of just in the most plain text definition, what do we mean when we talk about something like nationalism? So first and foremost, nationalism is nothing more than a political ideology. That is to say that nationalism is a way of organizing a kind of political consensus of how individuals ought to understand their connection to a nation, or how a governing state ought to understand its connection to a people. We can say that nationalism promotes the interest of a particular nation state, especially in regards to sovereignty, a people, and land. So nationalism oftentimes is thought of in a very crude binary that has some truths to it, but that binary is one that we need to unfold, parse out, and explore some of the tensions of to understand the ways in which nationalism can be more complicated and we can appreciate these nuances. Oftentimes individuals think about nationalism as either virtue or violence, but we really want to problematize this binary between virtue and violence because nationalism is ultimately going to have to be more complicated than just a system of virtue or just a system that promotes violence. Understanding that the history of nationalism can be virtuous, but the contemporary demonstrations of nationalist rhetoric or thought can be violent can help us understand the future of nationalism in contemporary political discourse and the ways in which it can be relevant to us as we have to navigate debates where conversations around nationalist rhetoric are going to be increasingly more common given the contemporary political sensibilities. So first we can understand nationalism in terms of virtue as civic nationalism, a system whereby individuals are tied together, bound together, and have common connections based off of their affinity to a political system and its values. For example, in the United States, we practice a form of civic nationalism where we all have a kind of common connection to the values of things like liberty, mixed market economies, enterprise, systems of democracy and representation, and our shared history around those post-Enlightenment ideals and their interactions. But nationalism can also be ostensibly virtuous in that individuals often connect it to an idea of patriotism, that one is doing something well and they're doing it well for the cause of their nation. This can also lead us to an understanding of nationalism as duty, and that we're fulfilling some kind of duty when we're upholding nationalistic obligations, attitudes, rhetorics, practices, etc. Because the history of nationalism arises out of an urge for self-determination, or the right of a people to determine their futures, to rule themselves, and to establish independently their own political practices based on ties they have to their cultures and their cultural affinities, their backgrounds, common languages, experiences, etc. In this way, we can understand nationalism in terms of virtue as a project of anti-imperialism. In fact, some of the earliest nations, if we think about the trajectory and history of political philosophy and political history, the nation arises as an anti-imperialist project. As many of you, I'm sure, are familiar from some of your crash courses in history, early foundations of law and ruling in Europe and in other areas had a kind of divine right of kings mentality, whereby monarchies and empires ruled unquestionably by the people because of some kind of divine or God-given right to rule a specific area. Obviously, various continents, various cultures have a pluralistic approach to ruling themselves. And it's important to note that some nations or some conceptions of nations may even predate our understandings of some European empires or of some European monarchies. We can think of, for example, nations of tribes of Native Americans, nations of tribes of indigenous populations, some of whom obviously utilize systems like empire, utilize systems like monarchy, or other mixed systems that deserve their own further exploration. But in terms of the modern nation state, as we conceive of it now, take our own, for example. The United States began as 13 colonies under a classical system of European colonialism, an early form of European colonialism. So in this sense, the strive for an American nation or an American state began as an anti-imperialist project. Ireland has a strong history of nationalism, where a number of individuals want to have a discourse that centers around their shared Irish heritage to be anti-imperialist against something like the British Empire. Similarly, India, movements championed by Gandhi, for example, had strong nationalist tone to them, insofar as they wanted to establish India through a system of self-determination, whereby individuals who could share a common culture, a common language, and more importantly, a common desire for self-determination could work against imperialism to establish a nation. In this way, nationalism historically also may be considered virtuous in that it fosters a sense of cultural obligation to the history that a particular people might have to the cause of their nation. But we also know that nationalism can be violent. The nationalism has a history of violence and can breed attitudes, rhetorics, and sensibilities that are akin or analogous to violence, that can encourage violence, and that can promote both physiological, psychological, somatic, and verbal practices of violence. In this way, we often think of nationalism in terms of ethno-nationalism, the idea that only a specific group of people based off of that previously spoken common ancestry, common culture, common language have the right to exist in a particular place. We can also think of irredentism, the idea that historically a specific group of people have a unique claim to a specific piece of land. The most common case of irredentism right now in the status quo is unfolding in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where something like Zionism is a nationalism that's oppressing, in many instances, Palestinians who believe that they also have a claim to a similar area of land. Nationalism is a core conversation in the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue as we unfold approaches to recognize the ways in which both groups of individuals have a historical claim to a region, and both groups of individuals have a kind of historical approach that undergirds the belief system with which they approach those dialogues, with which they try to navigate or negotiate those kinds of conflicts. And in this way, irredentism can be the nationalism that can be violent, in that one group of individuals is willing to utilize violence in a number of cases, a number of scenarios, to execute their supposed right to a specific place of land. Nationalism can be otherizing, in that it creates in-groups and out-groups, where in order for you to be a member of a nation, you have to categorize the nation, the land, the people as set apart from other regions, other areas. That oftentimes involves the codification and establishment of borders, national languages, national religions, national mythos. And we'll talk a lot more about the idea of a national mythology as really important to understanding both the history of nationalism and its contemporary iterations and relevancies. But nationalism can also lend itself to things like fascism. We see this really early on in the history of 20th century Europe. And perhaps even 21st century Europe, when we think about things like Hungary and Viktor Orban and the conversation happening there, or Turkey, where nationalism can lend itself to such a coalescing of unbridled power that fascism takes root. In this way, nationalism can be violent in that it usurps other rights or coalesces a people together for power. It can also be isolationist in that it typically rejects the hypothesis, practices, and thesis of globalism and globalization, or a liberal order of rule like the European Union. So we can think of nationalism here in terms of Brexit in the United Kingdom, where Nigel Farage and those individuals from the Tory and other rightist parties that wanted to leave the United Kingdom utilized a nationalist rhetoric behind nationalist sensibilities to become isolationist, to reject a kind of multilateral approach to governance. Again, in other ways, other individuals in the UK might use this language of virtue, that the right of self-determination for individuals in the UK against some of the European Union's measures for things like economic austerity measures or rule were impending on their right to self-determination. I wouldn't call this an anti-imperialist project in the case of Brexit, but another example in the ways in which nationalism can have this binary that we can problematize between virtue and violence. But important to note here that one of the violent aspects typically conceived of nationalism is its tendency to be isolating, to kind of close in on itself and ignore other aspects of the world for the sake of its own importance, for the sake of its own highlighting. We can see this in things like America First policies championed by Tea Party conservatives and Donald Trump, where pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords are a form of isolationist politics, ignoring commitments we have to the G7 summit and our allies, abandoning claims to NATO. All of these can be examples of isolationist politics that can easily accompany nationalism. So we know that we prototypically have this binary between nationalism as a project of virtue, whereby individuals can have common claims to an area, fulfill their duties, act patriotically in a project of anti-imperialism to self-determine their freedoms, liberties, and projects, but can also be violent when that becomes otherizing, when it focuses on irredentism, when it lends itself to fascism, or when it practices things like isolationism or ethno-nationalism. So we want to work through this binary by exploring some of the paradoxes of modern nationalism and really think about the way these paradoxes operate in the rhetoric that you've observed in contemporary politics as it pertains to nationalism, or some of the motions or debates you've encountered and the ways in which these paradoxes complicate any discussion or conversation about nationalism. So I think there are three paradoxes that can help us think through nationalism. These aren't my own paradoxes, though I'm really fond of them. They come from a political theorist by the name of Benedict Anderson, who I encourage any of you to do more research on if a conversation about nationalism, or in particular mythos of nationalism, interests you, or the kind of debate research that you want to pursue in the future. So Anderson, in his book, Imagined Communities, writes about three paradoxes that we can use to think through modern nationalism and parse out some of the tensions that exist in between that binary of virtue and violence. So the first paradox has to do with antiquity. It's what we would commonly call the antiquity paradox. And it's the idea that nationalism is a relatively recent model of political organizing. If we think about the history of most nation states, from the United States, which is not a very old nation, to India, which only more recently gained independence from Britain, to other areas like Taiwan that even more recently have a claim to their own kind of nationalism, to Catalonia, which wants to become independent from Spain, or even the history of Britain, that nationalism is a relatively recent model of political organizing, that obviously things predate nationalism, like empire or monarchy, feudalism, many other organizing systems of political economy that are distinct from nationalism predate nationalism by decades to centuries to even thousands of years. If we think about early like proto-democratic systems that arise in early Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, where the nation state is not as recent a system, and it's at least in its modern conception that we tend to think of it as. And this is interesting because nationalist rhetoric and sensibilities rely on a sense of antiquity and nostalgia. Take America, for example. There's a kind of nostalgic rhetoric in politics that often dominates national discourse. Like the slogan, "Make America Great Again," harkens back to a past time when we can draw on a history of American political action and products. But what's really interesting about this paradox is that nationalism is relatively modern, but tends to rely on relatively ancient forms of discourse or remembering that are oftentimes false. And it's also important to note that states are historically transient and subject to large change, but nationalism lays claim to a sense of the everlasting oftentimes. Nations are supposed to exist in the minds of people forever and have always existed forever. In this way, the antiquity paradox points out the kind of tension between virtue and violence, and that many nations had to create themselves through some kind of episode or rupture of violence, which points back to their creativeness, their recentness, or their modernness. But at the same time, modern nationalist politics and rhetoric try to evoke the idea of a historical sense of people. We can think about Russia, for example, in this conversation, where Russia's larger Eurasian political project to do things like capture the Ukraine and Crimea, or to capture Belarusian states and reclaim what they consider lost territories, relies on a kind of antiquity paradox, where Russia, as we know it as a nation state, is incredibly modern after the fall of the Soviet Union, but relies on an ancient rhetoric, or so they say, about a Eurasian people, a Soviet people, a Russian people, for their right, supposed right, to reclaim those territories. So this paradox is really interesting because nationalism will, for a while, be relatively modern. But if you listen to nationalist rhetoric, nationalist populists, and even nationalist conversations, oftentimes you'll easily and very quickly find this sense of appeal to antiquity, appeal to nostalgia, appeal to an ancient people and their right to a land, which is oftentimes way more complex, way more nuanced, and too reductionist displays of the history that undergird a particular land, a particular social mode of organization, a particular people. But the second paradox that I really want to talk about is what we often call the universal paradox. Again, these are Benedict Anderson's own theorizations of paradoxes we can use to think through nationalism. And the universal paradox is as follows. Nationalism is found in nearly every continent, but its focus is narrow. Just think about that for a moment. You can probably identify on every continent and nation you know right now that has a nationalist undertone. I can think of Brazil, where Bolsonaro is quite nationalist in his rhetoric about how Brazil ought to move through the coronavirus pandemic, how Brazil ought to operate its future in regard to the Amazon and the rights it has to dominate that land. We can think about nationalism in the United States. We can think about nationalism in Britain and in Ireland. We can think about nationalism in India, nationalism in South Africa, nationalism in Russia, nationalism in China. Nationalism is writ large everywhere. So what does it mean for a phenomenon to be simultaneously all over the place, but narrow in focus, and that the subject of each nationalism is supposedly uniquely different? Just a paradox to think through. So various countries have adopted country-first policies, like the America First policies many of us have been very recently familiarized with. In an increasingly globalized world, this presents its own kind of paradox. If every single nation adopts a country-first policies, the interests and self-interests, national interests of each nation cannot possibly be so analogous that areas of conflict don't interrupt. So there's a paradox here. And in what ways is it actually in the interest of a nation to be so isolated that they practice autarky, or that they practice an America first or country first policy? A paradox to think through. If only one nation or two is doing it, perhaps it works in their favor. Maybe the UK will experience some changes that help them in their favor in terms of leaving Brexit. Maybe in our America First policies, we were able to shake things up in terms of the kind of commitment our allies might be willing to make to NATO, but more often than not, a kind of country-first policy in an increasingly globalized world doesn't necessarily work out in that country's best interests, insofar as multilateralism, these kind of economic dependence, tend to be the best ways to ensure peace in an increasingly globalized world. So that's an interesting paradox to think through, that various countries have adopted country-first policies in a world that increasingly relies on multilateralism, cross-cultural exchanges, and globalization. And this is the last part of this paradox. Virtually everyone has a nation. even though nationalism claims the only unifying factor is between members of the same nation. So you and I share a common kind of background in that we are, most of us, though not all of us, are members of the United States. But what's interesting is that individuals who are members of Mexico or citizens of Canada or citizens of the UK can share a similar connection in that we are all members of a nation, even if not the same nation. But there's a paradox in nationalism that you can only have a unifying factor if you're a member of the same nation, even though everyone is a member of some nation. So in this ways, nationalism is incredibly universal, though surprisingly particular. So think through that paradox, as it can complicate the binary between nationalism as virtue or nationalism as violence. In particular, I think this paradox can highlight the ways in which nationalism has to necessarily be more nuanced, because individual countries' approaches to nationalist rhetoric, nationalist sensibilities, or nationalist policies and practices are going to be incredibly distinct and unique. Even though we can identify nationalism as a kind of common phenomenon, its outputs, its approaches are going to always have their own unique cultural and political ramifications. So we can, in this way, not homogenize nationalism too quickly as to condemn it or demonize it, but it deserves a much more careful scrutiny in terms of its particulars, in terms of its members and its components. And the last paradox that I want to talk about is the coherence paradox. In this paradox, nationalism is incredibly powerful. Many people would die for their nation, or if they wouldn't personally die for their nation, a number of individuals can imagine scenarios in which they can justify the deaths of others for their particular nation. Whether in our case, that's the history of the war on terror, the engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, engagements in a number of other scenarios for other countries that involve civil wars, where you can divide your nation and die for your nation. But writ large, nationalism has the power to organize individuals so much so that they would give their lives for their nation. In this way, we can think about the idea of the fallen soldier as being integral to many countries' motifs of patriotism, that individuals who die for their country tend to pick up the kind of greatest honor that that country can offer its citizenry, or the kind of greatest sacrifice a citizen can offer to its nation. And that's not something to be taken for granted in our thinking through nationalism, that even though we might often think, oh, nationalism is esoteric or nationalism is kind of loosely assembled, that it's so powerful that individuals could condemn others' lives or willingly sacrifice their own should at least elucidate for us the kind of magnifying political power it has as a tool of organization and as a tool of justification. So just take that first. But then also, nationalism is hard to define and it lacks a robust philosophical basis. This goes back to the second paradox about particulars, that even though it's a universal phenomenon, its particular outcomes and practices differ dramatically. So even though most individuals might be willing to die for their nation, the kind of nationalism their nation practices can be hard to define or lack a kind of coherence. Nationalism's demands and the principles of a nation can change and be inconsistent, but oftentimes belief, commitment, and faith in a nation and its cause tend not to waver. So in the case of our own nation, we can go through political cycles whereby we go in and out of wars. We change our commitments to climate change, where apparently America first, and then weeks later, Biden says that we have a stronger multilateral commitment than ever. These kinds of policies of a nation can change on a dime. In most democracies, in a period of 4 to 8 years, policies can change drastically, especially through the increasing exercise of executive actions. But a claim to a nation and its demand to hold on a people tend to writ large not change that much. Think about soldiers in this instance. A majority of soldiers will carry out their terms, their tours, and their tenures through a military under numerous political leaders with numerous personal ideologies and practices or parties. And in this way, there's an incoherence, but a simultaneous coherence to nationalism, and that nationalism can cohere itself together tightly and oftentimes survive these kinds of tortuous changes in the minute aspects of political life. But in that way, it lacks a coherence. It can be incoherent, and that it's hard to define, and it oftentimes experiences a philosophical poverty or an intellectual bankruptcy, and that there's no unified theory oftentimes of nationalism's demands of a citizen. In this way, we can think about economic theory, right? We can think about Marxism, capitalism, socialism. We can think about autarky, a number of subcategories of each of those systems. And nationalism does not give us a clear economic formula or prescription. It's not normative economically. If I tell you I'm a nationalist, it's very unclear what my economic policies are, because those oftentimes probably depend not only on my individual nation, time period, but also my political party or epoch in that nation. And in this way, nationalism can be intellectually bankrupt. And that as far as political ideologies, philosophies, or theories go, it does not prescribe much. It doesn't offer many normative accounts, aside from the generally ambiguous act in the best interest of your nation and your nation alone. So I want to talk about nationalism and rights. This is more on the virtue, but also, again, on the violent side of nationalism, to parse out these tensions, thinking through those paradoxes and problematizing this binary. So nationalism and rights has a complicated relationship, a contrarian approach to human rights, if you would. In many ways, in the terms of the history of modern political philosophy, nationalism is the foundation of civic and political rights, because rights must have institutional backings. It's not enough to say that you have a right to something if an institution is not there to guarantee your right and see it through. For a court to say, yes, that is the case, for a governing body to give you the actual thing, all these kinds of scenarios that require institutional action to actually back up a claim. So many rights are derived from one's claim to a nation. You know, I'm sure a number of us grew up with the mythology that we have a right to liberty, or a right to freedom because, and uniquely because, we are American. And we'll talk about that more as it can be complicated with the approach to human rights or other rights theory writ large. So the nation state often acts as the first and primary guarantor of rights. Think here about things like extradition, the practice whereby if you commit a crime in the US and you flee to France, for example, we can petition France to have you sent back to the US so that we can try you for those claims. But a number of times let's say you commit a crime in France and you come back to the US, it's unlikely that the US would be eager to send you to France to be charged for that crime, because the nation acts as the guarantor of your rights. Really similar cases where individuals could be kidnapped. I'm sure a number of us might be familiar with the Iran hostage scandal, where a number of Americans were taken hostage by non-state Iranian actors who had some obvious backing of the Iranian state, and it was a terrorist scenario. And I think hostages are also an interesting case where the nation acts as a guarantor of rights because that person taken abroad was un-American. We can also think about the classic case of, I forget his name, but the teenager that was arrested, the college student in China. You know, there's a lot of American activity. The nation can kind of coalesce around the idea that an American should not be arrested abroad, and if they are, we should give them some rights. In this ways, embassies can be a very interesting part of this discussion. If you go to Israel, for example, and the IDF were to arrest you, a consulate from the American embassy, a lawyer, would be there within hours to represent your rights as an American in other countries. Similarly, if we were to arrest an individual from France in our nation or from Mexico, they could contact their local embassy, where the first defender of their rights would be their home nation state. In this ways, citizenry is oftentimes the guarantor of a number of rights. But that's, again, a complicated and not always clear discussion, and we'll talk about that further throughout the lecture. And so this can hint, my apologies, and the ways in which international law may be a growing but contemporarily weak foundation for rights, and nations themselves, nation states, and claims to an individual's right to a nation that acts as the guarantor, the foundation, the cultural justification, practice, and execution of rights, whereby individuals identify rights holders and rights recipients. But it can also act as an incredible dismissal of human rights. Nationalism historically has been responsible for some of the most egregious and most aggressive forms of human rights abuses, like genocide and civil war. These things are absolutely atrocious and oftentimes have their basis in a kind of nationalist rhetoric or nationalist history. Here, a dismissal of human rights means that nationalism might reject international auditing of violations or rely on a cultural mythos. It can that otherizes out groups. In this way, it's easier to rule homogenous populations, so a number of nations might decide that those individuals who cannot easily assimilate into their context ought to be subject to just the worst forms of atrocity. We can think about Uyghur Muslims and China's project for nationalism, whereby individuals who are not from the Han majority are oftentimes subject to truly atrocious forms of human rights violations, but rejecting international auditing off the basis of sovereignty, all these things are part of nationalist projects. So in terms of the foundation of civic and political rights, nationalism can be seen as a project of anti-imperialism or a project of ethnocentrism. So it's important that we understand those distinctions and the ways in which nationalism on its particular kind of bedrock or foundation can result in different kinds of practices or products. The necessity of a national story is also really important for the maintenance of nationalism, but also the state. Memories and memorials are crucial to establish those mythos, the mythologies that keep a nation going. So I want you to think about this kind of higher order question. What makes a state distinct from a nation? We know a number of states. Think about transitional states, states that recently established, states that failed to properly establish, states that go through civil war and then reestablish themselves. So we have states, but not all states are nations. So I want us to think about what makes a state distinct from a nation, and that a state might be able to aspire to successfully become a nation, or that even conversely, a nation may not have a state. Here we can think of the Kurds, for example, that oftentimes use the language of a Kurdish nation, but may lack a concrete state. So this, with the idea of the Kurds, for example, who lack a state, but use the language of Kurdish nation, it's important to know that there's a mythology that undergirds that it's oftentimes a kind of cultural narrative, a story, a mythos that helps propel that kind of idea forward. So national stories are incredibly unifying, and this is why they're important. National stories facilitate a sense of belonging. If any of you do any reading or exploration into literature on World War II and the rise of fascism, you'll note that in the literature, there's an incredible attention paid to the theme of loneliness. There's a political theorist by the name of Bataille, who's incredibly popular, increasingly popular as we go through these kinds of fascist and populist resurgences. And Bataille is fascinated in the ways in which emotions and fervor and culture and mythos can be super important as tools of political mobilization. And he knows that the fascists are incredible at that. Fascists are really, really good at appealing to a narrative, oftentimes a false narrative, but a narrative nonetheless that can be organizing and coalescing. So loneliness gets a really strong attention in the literature in World War II and fascism, because individuals who experience extreme loneliness are very easy to coerce into these false mythologies of belonging. We can also think about things like the incel movement in the United States, a group oftentimes of white men, young white men who orchestrate a number of mass shootings. A common theme is oftentimes their ostracization, their loneliness. So in this ways, ethno-nationalism, a kind of like right-wing supremacy, like we saw in Charlottesville, can lend itself incredibly persuasively to individuals who are yearning for belonging. Now, national stories can also have a kind of disbelonging to individuals who come from, for example, diaspora groups, who can believe, rightfully so, that a nation may not be built for them, or may not be a place that was intended for them, like African Americans, given our Three-Fifths Compromise, our history of slavery, the reality of Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow, and redlining. So national stories can have unifying effects whereby they foster belonging and appeal to individuals who are especially susceptible to narratives of wanting belonging, or they can be otherizing if the national story, its memory and its reality reflects a kind of immediate discounting of a certain group, or an immediate ostracization, otherization, vilification, or oppression of a particular group. And so national stories can be really important. Right now in the US, we have this idea that we need a better national story. We see this, I think, really recently with the 1619 Project, and the attention being paid to the reporter from UNC Chapel Hill, the professor, I believe her name is Hannah Nicole Jones, but you can do your own research on her project, the 1619 Project, that tries to kind of orchestrate the national project as we understand it for the contemporary US, such that we get our national story, our history correct, so that individuals either feel like they properly belong or can have the proper sense of belonging if they've always felt like they belong, to know why is that. But nationalism and national stories can also motivate civil participation. We can talk about that in a number of forums, where civil participation, either by enlisting in the military, by voting, can be a strong part of a national story. I think a number of individuals who come from Ireland, I have a number of friends who come from Ireland, have a strong sense of civil participation in their votes. And the debate about Northern Ireland and its successionary movements, the stories of the IRA and its history, will be incredibly powerful there as tools of political mobilization. But nationalism and its story also fosters the state's sense of legitimacy, so that when the state declares war, when it takes actions, when it creates taxes, when it creates rules, it doesn't have to work too hard to justify its rule over a people. The national story oftentimes does the work. So our national story is complicated and oftentimes missing integral elements of our history. We're oftentimes sold the narrative that we're the creation or American experiment or project of these post-Enlightenment ideals, whereby freedom and liberty, civil projects, civil society organizations, voting, representation can all carry themselves out. Religious freedom, freedom of expression. So our national story is that we are a unique melting pot where there's no central supposed ethnicity of individuals who are welcome. Anybody who can follow the virtues of civic nationalism is welcome. But obviously it's not the entire story. Something like the 1619 Project points out the ways in which this nation in particular has its founding on the backs of anti-Blackness in a number of very explicit ways that have been tried to have been made implicit or even opaque or not super visible. So in this way, a nation may lack a sense of legitimacy for some individuals who believe that a number of the state's exercises are illegitimate based on their history. So national stories, getting them right, having them be accurate or fostering them so that they're intentionally inaccurate can be an integral part of a state's survival, of a state's governance, all those really important things. Awesome. I'm going to have you look over these areas here about disasters, threats, domestic threats, and historic moments, and think about ways and moments in your life or moments that you can remember from history, perhaps, where the importance of a national story was important for the way in which our nation or any other nation moved through a kind of threat, disaster, or historic moment. While I very quickly grab my laptop charger so that my laptop does not die. Great. So we can think about natural disasters like Katrina, for example, where nationalism was an important part of the conversation for how Bush moved through the conversation in regards to Katrina, that America specifically had been attacked by a natural disaster, by a hurricane. The individuals in Louisiana who were suffering were uniquely American. And this way, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is an incredible, it oftentimes lies in incredibly nationalistic narratives. It's pretty rare that the federal government gives a specific state a pool of money and only that state. It rarely happens. The virtues of federalism or the systems of federalism are such that individual states tend to manage themselves with at most marginal help from the federal government or universal help from the federal government, not particular help. But when Louisiana or Texas or Florida or New Jersey is hit by a hurricane, the federal government will step in and pour millions of dollars of Californians and New Mexicans and like North Carolinians and Ohioans. My point is all these states who aren't the ones impacted money to a particular state. So how is it that Californians can justify giving a ton of their taxpayer money to individuals who had to evacuate a hurricane in Florida? It's oftentimes that nationalist rhetoric that you may be from California, but your tax money should right now go to individuals in Louisiana because they're American. And again, it's that nationalist rhetoric that oftentimes successfully allows a number of countries to navigate the movement of resources for natural disasters, but also external threats. I can think of something like 9/11 or the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where nations can quickly respond by coalescing around a common enemy, or domestic threats, things like attempted assassination attempts or the January 6th insurrection. All of these things tend to be historic moments, but there's a number of other historic moments, like national elections themselves, that can lend themselves to the necessity of a national story and the ways in which nationalism and its rhetoric can be integral, not only for fostering a kind of fascism, obviously, but sometimes less obviously, but equally as true for fostering a kind of liberalism that adequately responds to the demands of a nation or the demands of a people by relying on a kind of our country, our people kind of rhetoric. So we talked about 9/11, for example. Nationalist rhetoric was incredibly important in organizing resources around 9/11. But in this way, the virtues of the bureaucratic system with which the country responded in the immediate hours after 9/11, like halting flights, creating systems through TSA, organizing firefighters, other resources from FEMA to respond to 9/11 may have been kind of virtuous action, but the creation of the Patriot Act, the subsequent villainization of a number of people from Muslim countries, Donald Trump's own Muslim ban years later. All these things are nationalism unfolding themselves across this binary of both virtue and violence in ways that we can problematize, but not necessarily reduce. Or the January 6th insurrection, another incredible example of the reductionary nature of this binary. You can see American flags being waved all over this picture. We're individuals who literally stormed the Capitol in an attempt to overturn the election results being certified by the Congress, were supposedly acting out of nationalist interests. But again, the language of condemnation coming from Joe Biden, from Elizabeth Warren, from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, even from Mike Pence, relies on this idea that that's not who we are, that like, again, it's America that we can harken back to, a nation that we can use to vilify these individuals as domestic terrorists. All those things again show the equilibrium along which nationalism unfolds itself on both sides of individuals who would either detract and dissent from this kind of insurrection, or who would condemn it, who would participate in it, all those things. And similarly, one of Joe Biden's biggest campaign slogans that was incredibly successful is that his campaign was a battle for the soul of the nation, right? Not the country or the state, but the nation. And this language of soul gets back to the idea that a nation's ultimately about a mythos, a culture, a people, that what's at stake here is the character, the soul of individuals and their collective kind of identity in that election. So nationalist rhetoric is employed often, I promise you, often, on both sides of numerous political conversations by Democrats and conservatives, progressives and rightists, leftists and centrists. Nationalism cannot be reduced to a simple virtuous or a simple violent binary, but has to be problematized by the paradoxes we experience with it, the ways in which it's increasingly a modern phenomenon that relies on antiquity, the ways in which it's universal, but it's important to give attention to particulars, and the ways in which it lacks a kind of coherence, but is incredibly powerful at the same time as a tool of social and political mobilization and organization. So how do you construct a national story? Oftentimes through nation building. This is like conscription. Oftentimes the best nations with the strongest national stories have mandatory conscription. Israelis, by and large, writ large, have an incredibly unified national narrative, and a lot of that has to do with mandatory conscription, like in Colombia or Egypt or Norway, where everybody in Norway has mandatory conscription, or China, where you have to serve 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it may be in the military, regardless of your gender, at the age of 18. And conscription historically is one of the tools that political analysts and theorists recommend when you build a nation. So when Israel was constructed, it was recommended by the UN they employ conscription because it's a quick way to foster a sense of national identity and build a nation. But also national curriculums. This is where something like, again, debates about critical race theory in school curricula are very important to conversations about nationalism, getting our national story correct, per se, and the construction of national symbols, things like flags, anthems, memorials, parks, all those kinds of things are important for nation building, and because they foster a sense of national identity. So a question to ponder here is, do people have a right to a nation? And if so, this is an incredibly complicated question. Is it any nation, a nation of their choosing? If a nation doesn't currently exist where they would like a nation, do they have a right to a nation there? Again, distinct from a question of self-determination, but perhaps not so distinct that we can't use those questions to parse out this question. But let's think about national identity. There's a few noteworthy observations that I think are important, that are surprising as we think through national identity. All of this goes back in line with problematizing our traditional conceptions of nationalism. So feelings about national identity may arise regardless of one's citizenship status. I know a number of individuals who are not citizens of the United States, but still feel that they have a strong sense of national identity to the US. Similarly, oftentimes members of diaspora, again, speaking about the Irish diaspora, a number of individuals were not born in Ireland, but their parents were, their grandparents were, but they still consider themselves to be Irish, and in that ways have a claim to a national identity. So feelings about national identity may arise regardless of and be maintained regardless of one's citizenship status, which is just incredibly fascinating to think about in terms of national identity and conversations about nationalism, in terms of problematizing that discourse. But also national identity signifies an awareness of difference. If I say I'm an American, I immediately can see that that means that that's different from being somewhere else or somebody else, or a member of someplace else. So individuals who hold dual citizenry and people who are first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, oftentimes experience that kind of fracturing where it's so difficult oftentimes to reconcile your supposed commitments to be aware of that supposed difference. And also it facilitates a sense of community or belonging that arises particularly from that sense of difference. Things to think through in terms of national identity. So this is a commercial that was aired at the most recent Super Bowl. I find it just fascinating. So I want you to watch this commercial, and then we'll work on a drill and have an end to the lecture.
Did you know that Norway sells way more electric cars per capita than the US? Norway. I won't stand for it. Never mind. With GM's new Ultimate battery, we're going to crush those losers. Crush them! Let's go, America. Norway's out EVing us. Wait, what's this? Oh, it's my daughter's birthday. She's really into pirates. I don't care. Grab an EV, meet me in Norway. Okay, can I say goodbye to my family? Nope. All right. Aquafina, sorry to disturb you, but Norway's beating us at EVs. Meet me there in an hour.
Can I ride with you?
No! GM's Ultium battery is made for all types of vehicles, so soon everyone can drive an EV. Whoa!
Why don't we all just go together?
Knowing Will is probably flying private.
Hey, Norway, listen up, you fish-loving! Oh, this place is adorable. Damn it. Where are you guys?
We're in Finland. Where are you?
I'm in Norway.
Norway? You're in Sweden.
Damn it. Did you know that?
So this commercial, I think, is incredibly fascinating. And if you notice, touches on so many of the themes we've discussed. For example, in groups and out groups, individuals who are Nordic versus individuals who are from the US, this kind of separation, the awareness of difference that facilitates the sense of belonging, but also competition. At the very end, GM message that like everybody's in, that's like a kind of communal project to reach this supposed goal of electric vehicles. There's a kind of nationalist rhetoric here that's motivating, in this case, uniquely and perhaps surprisingly, a more progressive or supposedly liberal cause. I'll just think about this commercial a bit. Norway made a response commercial, which you can find and watch, which is also just fascinating. So drill time. So you will submit a drill based on the lab you're in at this URL down here at the bottom, flipgrid.com/6b5c7a3a. I don't think you'll be able to copy and paste that, but I think it's short enough that you can just go to flipgrid.com, insert the /, and then type in that code. That code will take you to a page I've developed. It should say, I believe, GDS Nation, because you could think about us as all part of this imagined community, a nation of sorts, whereby we are bound together by our common commitments to debate, but probably not. Okay, so Gold and Silver Lab, you will identify 2 themes from the lecture that could help you approach an impromptu prep on the motion. This motion, this house regrets the demonization of nationalism. And you'll also pitch an idea for a substantive argument. This can be anywhere from 1 minute to 3 minutes long. You don't have to actually develop a full substantive. I want you to first pick out 2 themes from the lecture that you think would be relevant to this conversation, and be explicit, identify 2 specific themes that you took from your notes, that you took from the lecture that really stood out to you, that will help you think through the motion for an impromptu prep time. A kind of silent brainstorm at first, if you will, and then just pitch an idea for a substantive. This could be a tagline. It could be a quick 20-second crash course of what the argument might sound like, but I don't need all the warrants necessarily for this argument. So that's your assignment. This assignment is far more of a kind of brainstorming assignment. No clean lines needed necessarily on this kind of drill. You can give me a 1-minute video, you can give me a 3-minute video. Don't spend too much time on it, because I know that you need to take a break and stretch and drink water. Don't forget to do all of those things. But Gold and Silver Labs focus on this task here. And Blue and Red Labs, I want you to fully develop a substantive for the following motion on either side of the house. You can be proposition, or you can be opposition, government opposition. It really doesn't matter. It's your choice. But the motion reads, this house supports the use of nationalist rhetoric to advance progressive movements. Thinking about the kind of idea that maybe a nation has a particular obligation to combat climate change, or as a nation, we can all wear masks. So like whatever the idea is, I just want you to think about the idea of using nationalist rhetoric to advance a progressive movements and the benefits or downsides of that kind of approach, the kind of method of political organizing that employment of rhetoric could have for a progressive movement. So you should develop a substantive for this motion. This can be a 2-minute substantive, a 2.5-minute substantive. If you want to do some quick framing, where you characterize a progressive movement or you characterize nationalist rhetoric, you're welcome to do that. But don't submit a Flipgrid video that's longer than 3 or 4 minutes, because it's probably not an awesome use of your time management if you're practicing those things, and also just not necessary for this particular drill. So you'll do this at flipgrid.com. But before you do that, I want you to see the following slide real quick. After you successfully create your Flipgrid, you'll be given a page that says, like, do you want to share a link? Do you want to like post this or decorate it or whatever? You can click share link. Go ahead and take that link, copy and paste it, and submit it to this page. It's a Google form, so that everybody who's not me, your other lab leaders, Michael, CT, Mihal, whoever they may be, has access to that information that you just created, that drill, at tinyurl.com/worldscoredebate21 drills. This should be a Google form where you can insert information, maybe your name, the lecture title, and your drill. And just copy and paste the link to your drill so that people have access to it who are your lab leaders. And think through these things. I'll go back to this slide so you can, again, look at your assignments, your drill assignments. You can screenshot this, pause it, whatever is necessary. And feel free to come talk to me at my office hours about nationalism, about approaches to these drills, about questions you have about any of the concepts or theories that we parsed through today. Awesome, thanks.